I heard his laugh first, sharp and cutting through the quiet of the house, and then the words followed words that stopped me cold before I even set the cane against the counter. Dad is a failure. Just wait until Christmas Eve. Everyone will see. The sound of the mug slipping from my fingers and clinking against the counter seemed too loud, like it had betrayed me by announcing that I was listening. I held still breath locked in my chest, the ache in my back stiffening me even more. My son's voice carried down the hallway with ease, soaked in confidence, soaked in cruelty. Ethan told Madison that everything was ready. The slideshow, the stories, the little jokes he had rehearsed in his head for weeks. He said no one would walk out of the house that night without understanding that his father had always been the dead weight. Madison's voice joined his low and smooth and crueler for how soft it sounded. She told him to save the sharpest lines for when the room was lit, for when the glasses were full, for when everyone was already leaning forward in their seats. She said the tree, the lights, the decorations, all of it made the perfect stage. She promised people would laugh, that they would enjoy the roast, and that I would sit there with nothing left to say. I pressed my palm flat against the wall as if the old wood could hold me up. The furnace hummed in the basement, steady and warm, but my skin went cold. The winter air slid through the cracks in the windows and across the back of my neck. I leaned closer without meaning to, pulled by the sound of my son tearing me apart. Ethan's voice grew louder, brighter. He told Madison that after Christmas Eve, no one in the family would ever question who led the Whitmore name. He said the torch was his now that he was the one carrying it forward. My chest locked tight. The words pressed down heavier than the concrete slab that had given way under me years ago. I could still hear the screech of bending metal, the split second when the scaffolding gave out the hollow crack in my spine that stole everything I had built. That accident in 2015 ended the job, the work, the years of sweat I poured into every brick of this family's life. I thought surviving that fall was the hardest thing I would ever do. Tonight I learned that being betrayed by your own son cut deeper. Their laughter rose again from the living room, reckless, careless, as if cruelty was their favorite game. Madison teased that maybe Ethan should leave a touch of pity, that pity could make a story land better than mockery. Ethan brushed her off, said pity was for the weak, said the room needed to see me as I really was. They laughed together, the sound colliding and carrying through the air like broken glass. I took a step back, careful not to let the cane click against the floor. Each movement was slow, deliberate, though my breathing came rough and shallow. A man can carry a family through decades, every mortgage, every bill, every sleepless night spent working late, and still be stripped down to nothing with one laugh in the dark. I stopped in front of the photographs on the wall. Ethan's graduation stared back at me. He stood tall in his gown, his face young, proud, certain of everything. I was next to him, my suit pressed, my shoulders aching under the weight of pain I had hidden. My smile stretched wide because I had believed I had done right by him. Next to it hung his wedding photo, sunlight spilling across Ethan and Madison as they clasped hands. Linda's hand was tucked in mine, her smile soft, her eyes bright. That day I told myself every sacrifice had been worth it. Now the same faces plotted against me. My reflection hovered on the glass, older lined my shoulders, bent but not broken. Ethan's word echoed in my mind. Failure. 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 It stopped being a word and became a rhythm, a ringing like steel straining before it snaps. I lifted a hand and touched the frames, my fingers cold against the glass. For a moment I let myself remember the warmth of those days, the pride, the certainty that I had built something solid. Then I pulled my hand back and let it fall to my side. My legs carried me slowly to the chair by the front window. the cushion worn thin from years of use. I lowered myself carefully, the familiar scream of pain running up my spine, punishment for every step I took. Outside, snow had begun to fall. At first it came as a dusting light and soft, then it thickened heavier, drifting down in sheets that glowed beneath the street lamp. Each flake harmless on its own, but together heavy enough to bend branches, to collapse roofs, to bury streets. I watched them gather and thought of Ethan and Madison, so sure I had no weight left, no strength to change what they had set in motion. I closed my eyes and listened. Their laughter faded to murmurs, then to silence. I let the quiet settle over me, steadying my breath, the cold sinking into my chest, but not shaking me. My hands rested firm on my knees. The tremor that had run through them earlier was gone. When I opened my eyes, the street outside glowed under the snow. The world was hushed, waiting. I looked back at the photographs on the wall, the frozen smiles of a family that no longer felt like mine. The furnace hummed steady. The clock ticked on the mantel, each sound anchoring me. The weight of what I had heard settled fully into me, not crushing, not breaking. It sank deep, heavy but solid, like concrete poured into a mold, setting slow and strong, unmovable. The weight of what I had heard settled, and the house felt smaller, as if the walls had leaned in while the snow kept falling. I set the cane carefully, and moved through the quiet kitchen. I saw myself younger and tired. I remembered the first tuition bill for Ethan at Ohio State, the number that made my throat tighten, the way Linda and I sat at the table with a calculator and a yellow pad. We checked and rechecked, deciding that my overtime would cover the first semester, that the second would work itself out, because it had to. I drove him to Columbus in a truck that coughed at every light. He was all grins and plans, too excited to hear me when I told him to call if he needed anything. The bills kept coming. I said yes more often than I should have. I said yes to rent when roommates fell through. I said yes to a used car when the bus to his internship made him late. I said yes to the spring break he swore was a networking trip. I told myself that debt was a bridge and bridges had a purpose. A year later, he came home with a pitch, a platform that would connect contractors with clients. He said, "Dad, you know construction. You have the contacts. This will be easy." He needed seed money, and he needed it now. I told him I would help with what I had. I wrote a check that made us cut deep again, then another, when the first disappeared into developers and marketing that never quite found the right audience. When the bank would not lend more, he reached for credit. By the summer of 2018, the numbers told a story he would not read. The launch limped, the users did not come, the trial accounts did not convert. The cards kept swiping, and when the statements arrived, he told me the timing had been off, that the market was slow, that if I could help with the minimums for a few months, it would even out. The total climbed past 100,000. I covered what I could, and when I could not, he opened new cards to float the old ones. The balance settled finally at 150,000, a number that sat between us like a wall we both pretended was a window. Then the fall in 2015. Steel screamed, concrete shifted, and my spine took the count. Recovery was a job I never applied for and could not quit. I tried to keep working in smaller ways, handling calls, bidding jobs with David in the passenger seat, when I could not drive as far, but the site did not want a man who could not climb or lift. I moved from doing to directing, and even that faded. That was when Linda began to look at me from a different angle. She began to step in between Ethan and the hard edges that were meant to teach him where the edges were. She told me he was under pressure I did not understand. He would come by with updates, and she would meet him at the door. She began calling the accident the turning point. I became the variable everyone accounted for and then blamed. Ethan leaned into it. He said if I had been there more, his launch would have gone right. He said if I had used my contacts better, we would have found bigger clients. He said the company where I had given the best years of my body had never really respected me, and how could I teach him anything about winning if I had settled for being a cog? When he said these things, Linda pressed her lips together and did not contradict him. When I asked her later if she believed him, she said he was hurting, and people say things when they hurt. Then she would ask me to drop it. I moved through the kitchen and opened the cabinet where we kept the good glasses, the ones we only used at holidays and weddings. My hand found one and set it on the counter. I poured water from the pitcher and drank. Upstairs, I heard Emily turn in her sleep. She was the one person under this roof who looked at me and saw exactly what I was without calculation. Footsteps sounded in the hallway, and Linda appeared in the doorway, her robe tied at the waist. Her eyes moved to the glass in my hand, then to my face. She asked if I was all right. I told her I was fine. She looked past me toward the living room, and I knew she had heard them too, at least enough of it, to know the shape of what they had planned. She did not ask what Ethan had said. She asked if I had taken my medication. I told her yes. For a moment I thought she would step closer, put a hand on my arm. Instead, she stood at the edge of the room. I told her I had heard enough to understand. She said they were excited, and that I should not take it to heart. I told her it was hard to miss when a man used the word failure and meant his father. She looked at the floor, then at me, and her voice dropped. She said, maybe keep a low profile at the party. Ethan wants everything perfect. The words landed inside me. I was not being asked. I was being managed. I nodded because nodding was easier than such a small fight so late at night. She said he had worked hard on the evening and that it meant a lot to him to have it go smoothly. She thanked me for understanding. She turned to leave, then paused. She said softly that Emily had left a drawing on my nightstand and that I should look at it before I went to sleep. Then she was gone. I stood in the kitchen with the glass in my hand and the snow thickening outside. I walked to the sink, rinsed the glass, and set it upside down beside the dish rack. I turned off the kitchen light and let the room fall into quiet. On my way down the hall, I stopped at the photographs again. My fingers hovered over the graduation frame, then moved to the wedding picture. I saw all the things I had believed on those days, and all the things I had chosen not to see. In the bedroom, the lamp on the nightstand threw a soft circle of light over a sheet of paper. Emily had drawn us standing beneath a big tree with lopsided stars and too many lights. She had colored my coat blue and my cane bright red. Above our heads, she had printed 3 words in crooked letters that made my throat tighten. Strong like Grandpa. I sat on the edge of the bed, with the drawing in my hands, until the light from the lamp blurred at the edges. Somewhere in the house a floorboard settled. Somewhere beyond the windows, the snow kept falling. I felt the ache in my back, and the ache under it the deeper one. I set the drawing back on the nightstand and ran a hand over the blanket to smooth it. In the doorway, I could hear the house again. I stood and reached for the lamp. The room went into a soft gray. I felt the line that had been drawn thin at first, then darker, and I knew I would not step back from it. I left the bedroom in the dark and moved down the hall, the cane finding the rhythm of the floorboards, while the house held its breath. I passed the photographs without touching them and turned into the small room at the back, the one we used to call the study before it became a place where everything without a home came to rest. I pulled the office chair from under the desk, set my cane against the drawer handle, and lowered myself slow. The bottom file drawer stuck the way it always had. I laid 3 folders on the desk and opened the first. I found an invoice from Lakeview Catering. The holiday menu circled the total, underlined a note in my own hand that said delivery entrance at side door. My check number sat next to the total like a small dark eye that saw everything. I turned to 2015. The December invoice ran longer than usual, a note from the vendor reminding the driver to take care on the icy steps. The signature across the bottom tilted to the right, my handwriting shakier than before, but mine all the same. I paused, let the papers rest flat under my palms. I breathed in and the ache under my ribs loosened a little. Stories bend in memory, but paper does not. Paper keeps the truth in order. I stacked the most recent 5 years to one side and reached for the second folder. Earlier years. 2013, the year Ethan brought home a girlfriend who did not last until spring. Catering from a small deli on Mayfield Road. 2010, the first year we hosted everyone after he graduated, when Linda and I stood in the kitchen with our sleeves rolled and told each other we could handle it ourselves. I must have given in at the last minute. The invoice said so. Prime rib and roasted vegetables, delivery timed for 7. I took out a legal pad and a pen and began to make a list. Year, vendor, amount, check number, my initials in the margin after each entry. The pen moved with a steadiness that surprised me. When I filled one page, I tore it off clean and started another. The pile of invoices grew thicker on the chair beside me. My hands worked in a rhythm lift scan note set aside, and with each pass, the picture sharpened. When the desk was a low hill of paper, I reached for the phone and scrolled to Lakeview Catering. The call rang twice and a sleepy voice answered. I said, "This is Daniel Whitmore. I am sorry to call late. I need copies of holiday invoices from our past orders." He paused, then said, "Give me a moment to check." I listened to the soft clicks of a keyboard through the line. He came back and said he saw records from the last 8 seasons and that every order was listed under my account. He asked if I wanted them emailed. I said, "Yes, please send them tonight if you can." He said he would forward what he had and follow with the older records in the morning. I thanked him and ended the call. I opened the email on the old desktop and watched the attachments stack into the inbox one by one like boxes carried in from a truck. Each file showed the same thing. Billing contact, my name. Payment method, my checks or my card. I downloaded them and saved them into a folder named Winters. I clicked open the earliest one he had sent. The familiar logo sat in the corner, the date stamped near the top. I called Blue Lantern Bakery next. A recorded message told me to leave a note. I said my name and asked for duplicates of holiday invoices from the years we had ordered pies and tarts. I left my email and phone and thanked them. Then I opened the bank portal and searched back through the statements. The website made me click month by month, as if it too wanted me to feel the climb in my bones. Checks with memo lines that read, "Holiday dinner." December order balance due lined up in a clean column that felt like a spine straightening. I heard floorboards creak in the hall and looked up. The house held its shape and settled again. I went back to the paper. Somewhere in the second folder, I found a handwritten list from a year when we had asked neighbors to bring side dishes. My handwriting marked who brought what, and at the bottom I had written covered main and dessert. My initial beside it made me smile. Even when we asked for help, I had filled the center of the table. I clipped the pages in groups by year, slid them into clear sleeves, and labeled each with a strip of tape. I wrote plainly, 2010, 2011, 2012. The numbers lined up like a row of posts setting a boundary. When I finished, the stack stood a hand high. I pressed my palm flat across the top and felt the weight push back. I glanced at the clock. Midnight had come and gone. I flexed my fingers and opened a shallow drawer I had not used in a long time. Inside were the check stubs I had kept out of habit, tiny white teeth of paper lined in a metal tray. I ran my finger along the rows until I found numbers that matched the invoices. One by one, I laid them across the desk so they made a path from date to date. It looked like a worksite plan, clean and inevitable. I closed my eyes for a breath and saw Ethan at this same desk when he was 10. His face bent to a worksheet, his pencil moving too hard across the page. He had asked me if showing my work mattered if the answer was right. I had told him showing your work proves you did not guess. The memory sharpened and then faded. Now I would show my work, not to him alone but to everyone who had learned to believe his version. The printer rattled when I fed it the PDFs. Pages slid out warm ink bright against white. I stacked them to cool and slid each into a sleeve behind its matching year. When the last page settled into place, I closed the binder and felt my shoulders square. This was a ledger written in receipts and signatures. Whatever jokes Ethan had planned would have to climb over it. I stood with the binder in my left arm and the cane in my right. My back protested, then yielded. I walked to the doorway and switched off the lamp. The room fell into gray, and the window became a dark mirror. I could just make out my outline, the binder a block against my chest, as solid as a tool I had used all my life. In the hall, the photographs watched the same as before, but the air around them felt different. I stopped in front of Ethan's graduation picture and let my eyes rest there only a moment. The man I had been that day would have gone back to bed and hoped the storm blew past. The man in this hallway did not hope for that anymore. I carried the binder to the kitchen and set it on the table where we carved turkeys and sliced pies. I ran my hand along the cover like a mason, checking the face of a fresh-set stone. The house was quiet. The snow worked without sound, and inside me the line I had felt earlier now ran deep and straight. I turned out the kitchen light and left the binder where the morning sun would touch it. Then I made my slow way toward the bedroom, one step, then the next, the rhythm steady. There would be more to gather, more to verify, but I had found the beginning and given it a spine. Morning opened gray and quiet. The binder sat where I had left it, square on the kitchen table. I brewed coffee I did not drink, put on my coat, and slipped Emily's drawing into the inside pocket, where it rested warm against my chest. I moved slow, one careful step at a time, the cane finding the ground before I did. The church at the corner of Maple and 3rd rose out of the weather with its red brick and white steeple. The parking lot was half-full tire tracks making dark lines through new snow. Inside the vestibule, voices came from the fellowship hall, steady. I found John in the center of it, sleeves rolled, tape gun in hand. He saw me, and his eyes warmed. He said my name and asked if I had time to help with boxes. I said I did. He handed me a roll of labels and pointed to a table where they were sorting canned goods. Volunteers moved around me with armfuls of donations. There were stacks of blankets, rows of toiletries. The kitchen doors swung open and shut, letting out waves of heat and the sweet smell of something baking. A woman from the congregation lined up aluminum pans. Christmas Eve dinner service, lakeshore shelter. Hot meals were the priority. I nodded and she moved on. The labels clung to my fingers until I found a rhythm. John worked beside a group of teenagers stacking boxes too high on a rolling cart. He waved me over when the flow slowed, and we leaned against the wall for a moment. He asked how I was really doing. I said I was here, and sometimes that is the best answer a man can give. He waited, not pushing, and I found myself telling him more. I did not give him all of it, not the laugh, not the word that had cut me, but the shape of it. I told him there was a party planned at my house and that I was the guest no one wanted to see. He shook his head. We walked through this kitchen where the ovens were going, and volunteers were testing thermometers. John looked at me then, and I could see the question in his face before he asked it. He said, "Are you all set for food at your place?" I told him we always were. The binder rose in my mind, fresh ink on warm paper. Years of invoices said the opposite of magic. I watched a girl tape a label that read, "Keep cold," along the seam of a box, and an idea stepped forward from the crowd of thoughts and stood at attention. If I was the one whose name sat at the top of every order, I was the one who could decide where it went. If the dinner was meant to be a stage, I could pull the curtain and light another. The thought settled with the same weight as the binder. A fit that felt honest. I asked John how late shelters could take deliveries on Christmas Eve. He said the earlier the better, but that they made it work, especially when families were waiting in the cold. I asked if there were health rules I should know. He walked me through what they required. Hot food held at temperature. Sealed containers. Clear labels. Contacts at each site. He said their volunteers could handle distribution if someone brought the main. I told him I might want to do more than bring a pie. He smiled and asked if I needed help making calls. I said I would start with Lakeview Catering, then move down the list. He nodded and said he could send an email to the shelter directors so they would expect a shift. He knew better than to step ahead of a man who had just found a path. I stepped into the hallway and called Lakeview. The same owner answered, surprise softening his voice when I said I was calling again so soon. I told him I wanted to confirm addresses for upcoming deliveries and asked if changes could be made by the account holder. He said yes, as long as he had written confirmation, and it came from me. He asked if there was a problem. I said no problem at all and gave him an email address. He said he would watch for it. I thanked him and ended the call. I called Russo Trattoria next and left a message asking for the manager to return my call about a holiday order. Then Blue Lantern Bakery. A recorded voice asked me to leave details. I gave them my name and number and the dates I was referencing. My hand shook slightly as I slid the phone back into my coat pocket, not from fear, but from the sudden quiet after the movement. John found me by the coat rack with 2 paper cups of coffee. He handed me one, and we stood side by side watching a group of kids tie ribbon around toy boxes. He said sometimes a hand up is the difference between a pit and a place to stand. I asked him if he ever felt like the only way to make something right was to make something hurt. He took a slow sip and set the cup on the windowsill. He said, punishment has its place, but justice is not only that. He said real justice returns value to where it is needed most. The words landed without noise and stayed. I stood there with the cup warming my hands and felt something shift under my ribs. The plan that had taken shape was still a plan, still sharp at the edges, but it had gathered a different kind of weight. It would not just stop a show. It would feed people who were already standing in a cold line. We walked back through the hall. Volunteers were sealing the last of the boxes, and the kitchen had gone from chaotic to neat. John wrote down the names of 2 shelter directors and their cell numbers and slid the paper into my hand. He said, call them when you know your timeline, and we will match you with a doorway that needs what you bring. I told him I would call tonight. On the way out, I paused in the sanctuary. The big tree near the altar stood half-dressed, its lower branches already brushed with silver and red, the higher reaches waiting for taller hands. The place was empty, and warm wood pews holding the smell of polish and candle wax. I sat in the last row and let the quiet settle around me. A memory arrived me standing at the front years ago with a hammer at a workday. I smiled despite myself. I stood with care and made my way back to the vestibule. The cold hit my face like a clean cloth. The sky held that late December light that makes even the ordinary look almost holy. I walked to the truck and sat with my hands on the wheel for a long breath. The binder waited at home. The emails would be there lined up in the inbox like units ready to be put to work. The names and numbers in my pocket felt like tools. The line inside me that had been faint and then dark was now a path I could see under my feet. I turned the key and the engine answered, steady and familiar, and I steered toward Maple, toward 3rd, toward home. By the time I turned onto our street, the snow had softened the edges of everything. The binder sat where I had left it, square on the kitchen table, a quiet block of truth waiting its turn. Madison came in from the dining room with a bundle of napkins over one arm and a phone in her hand. She smiled all surface and said the rental chairs arrived on time, the florist confirmed the centerpieces, and the caterer would need space near the back door. She told me the plan for the evening in a tone that did not invite help. She said Ethan would make a short toast, then a slideshow would play, and the mood would be light. Then she glanced at my cane and said maybe I could pour the wine tonight. At least that was something I could handle. I steadied my voice and asked what she needed me to do before that. She said the best help would be to stay out of the way while she finished the table. She drifted past the binder and set her phone on the table without asking what it was for. She adjusted the dining room lights with the app, then waved me toward the living room, as if guiding a guest who had arrived too early. I caught a glimpse of the dining table as I moved. Madison kept moving, humming a tune that was not a tune so much as a sound people make when they do not want to hear anything else. She said she loved the way everything was coming together. I thought of the calls at the church, the steady voices that had answered late, the way the catering owner had said yes, of course, with the calm of a man who had done this 1,000 times. I thought of John's words about justice and where value belongs. The plan in my pocket felt heavier than my keys. The front door opened, and a gust of cold air brought Ethan's footsteps and Linda's voice. Ethan carried a box labeled candles and grinned in the mirror as he brushed at his hair with his fingers. He asked Madison if the lighting worked for photos. She said it would be perfect once the tree was on. Linda stepped into the kitchen and gave me a small smile that worried itself away at the corners. She asked if I had eaten. I said I would later. She nodded and began opening the candle box. Ethan breezed through the room, lifted a wine glass, held it up to the light, and said that the evening would have the right shine. He told Madison to make sure the big screen was ready for the slideshow and to set the volume just low enough that people leaned in. He slapped my shoulder lightly and said he hoped I was ready to play host. Madison followed him out with her perfect napkins. Linda lingered by the counter, looked at the binder, then at me. Her mouth opened and closed again. She said softly that there was a lot to do. She told me Ethan wanted everything perfect. I said I understood. She touched the back of a chair and left a small print in the dust I had missed, then drifted after them. I stayed where I was and watched the snow thicken on the hedges. My hands curled around the arms of the chair until the wood felt warm. Soft footsteps came down the stairs and stopped at the threshold. Emily stood there in striped socks and a sweater with a reindeer stitched on the front. She saw me and smiled the way children smile when they find the one person in the room who will always lean down to their height. She ran across the rug and climbed into my lap like she always had, careful of my cane. She asked if I had seen her drawing. I told her it was in my pocket, where it could hear my heart. Then she lifted her head and studied my face the way only children do, with open concern. She asked if someone said something mean. I said, people say things when they are nervous. She told me nervous is not an excuse. She said I was not a failure. She said I was her hero. The words loosened a knot in me I had not known how to untie. I placed my palm on the crown of her head and felt the fine hair and the warm scalp under it. I told her heroes are just people who keep standing. She slid off my lap and looked toward the dining room. She asked if she could put the place cards on the table. I said yes, and she ran to ask her mother. Madison came back with a tight smile and a stack of cards for Emily to carry. Emily finished and ran back to me whispering that she had put my card at the end because the end is closest to the kitchen, and that is where the warm plates come from. She asked if that was smart. I told her it was the smartest thing I had heard all day. Madison overheard and said the seating plan was already decided. She moved the card from the end to a chair near the corner, the kind of place you give a person when you want them present but not seen. She said it would flow better that way. I watched her hands move my name as if it were a piece in a game. I said nothing. My quiet was not surrender. It was a wall she could not see. Ethan returned with a bundle of cords and asked where the projector would look best. He asked Madison if the candles should be lit before or after the toast. She told him after to give the room a soft glow for the video. Linda arranged the tapers along the runner. I stood and walked to the kitchen table. My hand rested on the binder. Madison noticed and asked in a sweet tone if I needed help with anything heavy. She said it would not do to strain myself today. I said I had it. I carried the binder to the sideboard in the living room and set it upright between two framed family photos. The placement was not an accident. No one asked what was inside. Emily trailed me and slipped her hand into mine. She told me she had made a paper snowflake in school that morning, and that her teacher said the trick is to fold clean before you cut, because the fold decides the shape more than the scissors do. I told her her teacher was wise. She asked if she could tape the snowflake to the window when she finished coloring it. I said I would help her hang it straight. The house settled into the strange rhythm of people preparing to perform normal life. Music whispered from a speaker. The fridge door opened and closed. A spoon clinked against a bowl. Madison laughed in the dining room. Ethan tested the projector on the blank wall and grinned when a blue screen filled the room. Emily tugged my hand and led me to the front window. She pressed the paper snowflake to the glass, and I held the tape while she smoothed the corners with her palm. The snow outside kept falling layer on layer, and our breath fogged a small circle that cleared and fogged again. She said it looked like a star if you squinted. I said I saw it. Behind us, I heard Madison ask Ethan if he thought the corners of the room were too dim. Ethan said the corners did not matter. The center was what counted. He said the center was where the story would land. Emily let go of my hand and ran to fetch crayons for the next snowflake. I stayed by the window a moment longer, looking out at the drift building along the walk, and the branches bowed with white. The hurt from Madison's words still sat inside me sharp as a new cut, but the sting had changed shape. The small, warm weight of Emily's hand had turned it from something that bled into something that healed with pressure. I turned from the window and looked at the sideboard where the binder stood between our smiling faces. It looked right where it was, in plain sight. Quiet, patient, ready. Snow still sifted down when I stepped outside and crossed the walk, the binder a steady weight behind the front door, and Emily's drawing warm against my chest. Across the street, David Carter stood near his mailbox in a wool cap that had seen better seasons. He lifted a hand when he saw me and waited while I took the steps, slow and careful. He said the plows had been late again, and that old maple would be a mess by noon. I told him I had time if he had coffee. His garage smelled like oil and cedar. He cleared a spot at the workbench with the easy movements of a man who liked the company of tools. He asked about my back, and I said it behaved when I did not ask too much of it. He nodded, then looked over with the same question in his eyes he had used on the job when something was not square. He asked how I was otherwise. I told him I was taking measure of a few things, and that I needed to ask him about a year we did not talk about much. He looked at me and said 2010. I said yes. He said we had both seen the writing that summer. One of the partners wanted out, not dirty, just done. He said the man was a good foreman and a decent owner, but his marriage was pulling him west, and he did not want to bleed value out of the company by sticking around half a year longer than his spirit would. He said the numbers only worked if someone inside took the stake. He looked at me and said, "You did." He reminded me of the meeting at Hall and Avery, the small suite on the second floor, over a bakery that made the whole building smell like sugar. He said the operating agreement lay on the conference table like a blueprint, and that we read every line like it could collapse on us. He said you brought a cashier check and a second one to cover the capital account, and you kept your name off the office door because the office door had never meant much to you. He said you wanted the company strong and quiet, and you wanted the work to stay work. I felt the day rise back into me, the hum of the fluorescent light, the stamp thudding on paper. David kept talking in that steady way of his. He said the transfer of membership interest gave you 40% of Whitmore construction, and that an amendment to the operating agreement reflected the new schedule of members. He said your title stayed the same on paper. He reached under the bench and pulled out a small fireproof box. He said a man learns to keep copy sets when lawyers are involved, and that he had done so out of habit. Inside were folders thick with the weight of the years. He flipped until he found a tab with my name. He said, "I do not know what you need, but I kept these because it seemed smart." Assignment of membership interest with a date in October 2010. An amended operating agreement with a schedule of members that listed Whitmore Family Trust at 50, my name at 40, and David and the shop foreman each at 5. A buy-sell agreement that gave rights if a member wanted to dump shares without warning. He said Ethan had asked him once why I had been able to weather the slow months when other men could not. He told me he had shrugged and said some men save when they can. I ran a finger along the line that showed my interest. The ink had not faded. I asked how many people knew. David said the lawyer, of course, and the accountant and himself and the partner who left. He said Linda had known something in general terms because he had sat across from the two of us once when her questions were sharper than mine, and she signed where a spouse signs to acknowledge that assets had moved from one basket to another. He said Ethan never asked, and you never told, because telling him would have turned ownership into a performance, and the company did not need one more performance. We stood without speaking for a minute. David said what is going on, and I told him I could not put the whole story on his bench, but that I might need to show a room that I had not carried nothing all these years. He nodded and did not press. He said a room understands better when you hand it paper. He asked if I wanted copies or originals. I told him copies for now, that the originals should sit where they always had until the last moment. He stacked them in order, clipped them, and slipped the stack into a manila envelope that had a strip of red tape across one corner. He slid the envelope toward me and set his hand on it for a breath. He said he had watched me take hits that would have flattened other men, and that he had watched me get up in the plain way that makes other people forget they are watching something remarkable. He said a day comes when quiet strength needs a microphone, and that he would stand nearby if that day had come. I told him a day like that was walking up the drive, and that I was grateful for the company. He asked if I needed someone at the house later to move things, or to witness the simple truth of a fact on paper. I said I might, and he told me to call when the hour was set. He placed the little key back on his ring and shut the box. The world outside the garage had gone whiter. He walked me to the door, and we stood at the threshold. I crossed the street with the envelope under my coat and the snow tapping at my hat. In the kitchen, the binder waited like a block-set square, and I set the envelope beside it. I slid a chair out and sat with both palms on the table. I opened the envelope and lifted the top page. Names, dates, signatures. The company that had asked so much of my body had also held a share of my future, and I had not lost that when I fell. It had waited quiet the way good foundations do. I turned each page and let the facts pass through my hands. The ache in my back was there, but it had been joined by something else, a steadiness that rose through my ribs and into my shoulders. I remembered the conference room and the stamp and the box of pastries the lawyer had set on the table because it was easier to read when your hands had something sweet to do. The house breathed around me. The furnace took a long breath and let it go. From upstairs came the soft clatter of crayons and Emily's voice talking to her paper world. I rested my hand on both at once and felt the weight of them answer back. I took the envelope and the binder back to the truck and headed across town. The office Sophie used was above a small insurance agency near the church, a narrow staircase that made my back complain. Her door was open. Files stacked in neat rows along one wall, a framed degree that looked new. She stood when I stepped in. She asked if I had what we talked about on the phone. I set the binder on her desk and the manila envelope beside it. Then she opened the envelope and began to read. Her finger tracked the lines on the assignment of membership interest. She compared names and dates, and she nodded once when the numbers matched across pages. She flipped to the amended operating agreement and the schedule of members. She paused over the K-1 forms. Then she opened the binder and scanned the invoices, the checks, the list I had made by year and by vendor. She said we would take this in order. She asked if I still served as trustee of the living trust I had set up years ago for family planning. I told her yes. She asked if the trust instrument gave me sole discretion over distributions and the power to amend beneficiaries while alive. I said it did. She asked if I had ever made irrevocable gifts to Ethan out of that trust. I said no. She nodded and wrote a line on her legal pad. Next, she asked about the credit cards where Ethan and Madison had spending authority. I told her they were authorized users on 2 accounts, where I was the primary cardholder, one at a regional bank and one with a national issuer. She asked if the cards were current. I said yes. She asked if I had the account numbers and copies of the last statements. I set both on the desk. She asked about the wedding fund. I told her it was a separate savings account titled To Me Alone, opened at the credit union in 2018 when his engagement looked stable. It had pay-on-death provisions that named him in case I did not live to see the day, but otherwise it was mine to manage. She asked if there were any written promises or emails that changed those terms. I said there were none. She pressed the cap on her pen and nodded. She turned the invoices back toward me and asked about the upcoming holiday orders. I told her every vendor had me as account holder and billing contact. I had already spoken with 2 and left messages with the others. She told me to send written confirmations to each vendor today, copying their managers, stating that deliveries would go to shelters on the schedule attached, and that I would sign for the transfer at the door. She said if anyone pushed back, we would send a follow letter on her letterhead, making clear who had authority. She slid a stack of forms across the desk. One was a directive to remove authorized users from each credit account. One was a notice to close any digital wallets attached to those cards. One was a request for new cards with new numbers issued to me alone and mailed to her office. She said we would call the banks now, and she would be on the line as my counsel. We spent the next half hour on hold music and security prompts. She slid a notepad toward me with answers I had already given and tapped where the bank would ask for them again. She spoke when it was useful and stayed quiet when it was not. She made sure names and employee numbers were noted, that confirmations would be emailed, that a letter would follow. When the first bank completed the removal of authorized users, she asked the representative to confirm that all cards tied to those users were now deactivated at the processor level. When the second bank did the same, she asked for a notation that no reinstatement could occur without a signed request from me in person. Her voice did not waver. Mine did not have to. When we hung up, she called the credit union where the wedding fund sat. She handed me the handset when the manager came on. I told him I wanted to freeze withdrawals temporarily and then convert the account to a certificate with an early withdrawal penalty unless the withdrawal was initiated by me. He said they could do that with a signed instruction, faxed or emailed. Sophie drafted the instruction on her computer, printed it, and slid it across the desk. I signed, and she sent the scan while I was still capping the pen. The manager confirmed receipt and told me he would send a confirmation email by close of business. I thanked him. Sophie said we should also reset passwords, turn on two-factor where it had not been, and change contact emails to an address that Ethan and Madison did not know. I gave her an address I used only for business with David, and she updated each portal. She printed a set of letters on her letterhead. One addressed to each bank confirming what we had done by phone. One to the credit union confirming the freeze and the conversion. One to each vendor confirming new delivery instructions for the holiday orders. She added a letter addressed to anyone who might inquire at my house about those orders. She asked if I wanted to adjust beneficiaries on the trust while we were working. I told her I did. She retrieved the binder where I kept trust documents and turned to the amendment page. I removed Ethan and Madison as contingent recipients of discretionary holiday distributions and replaced their names with Emily's education subtrust and a general charitable designation for food insecurity programs in Cuyahoga County. I initialed every change. She witnessed and notarized. There was a stillness in the room when the stamp lifted from the paper. Sophie set the notary stamp aside and folded her hands on the desk. She said, "They think you have lost everything. The truth is, you never let go." I felt my shoulders come back into line without thinking. She slid one last document forward. It was a power of attorney that granted her limited authority for the next 2 weeks to act on my behalf for account and vendor communications. She said it would keep vendors from being rattled if a young lawyer called instead of an older man with a hurt back. I smiled and said, "Do it." She smiled back and said, "We already had." She printed copies of everything and clipped them into a second folder for me to carry. She kept the originals in a fireproof file with labels that made sense to her and would make sense to any lawyer who had to pick them up in an emergency. She gave me 2 envelopes already addressed and stamped. She asked me to drop them at the post office on my way home because paper still says what email cannot. Before I left, she asked if I was doing all right with the part of this that was not paperwork. I told her the work helped. She said work often does. She stood and walked me to the door. She said her father was at the church most of the day if I needed a quiet pew or a loud laugh. She said she would call when the confirmations came in and again when the vendors replied. I thanked her. She squeezed my shoulder once, firm and brief. I took the stairs slow and careful, the folder tucked under my arm. Outside, the sky had brightened. I crossed to the truck and sat with my hands on the wheel for a long moment. The world looked the same through the windshield. It did not feel the same. On the way home, I stopped at the post office and slid the envelopes into the slot. At the light on 3rd and Maple, I watched a man in a reflective jacket shovel the sidewalk in front of the pharmacy. Back in the kitchen, the binder waited, and the manila envelope from David. I added Sophie's folder to the stack. I reached for Emily's drawing in my inside pocket and set it on top. Then I turned to the sink and washed my hands. By the time the first cars began to arrive, Linda moved through rooms with a candle lighter and a worried smile. I shaved, buttoned a clean shirt, and tied the knot slow the way I used to tie loads when the weather threatened to take them. On the dresser, the manila envelope weighted thick with invoices and the list I had made. Beside it sat a small black document case that Sophie had packed with letters and copies, her neat tabs like rungs on a ladder. I slid both into my coat, checked the pockets for keys, and rested my hand for a breath on Emily's drawing, tucked where I could feel it. Downstairs, the front hall filled with coats and talk. Neighbors and cousins came through. Ethan talked with confidence cords in hand, saying the slides were cued and the timing perfect. Madison leaned toward an aunt. Tonight, she whispered, everyone will finally see the truth. The aunt gasped and patted Madison's arm. I moved past the dining room and paused. Place cards sat in a careful line, my name tucked near the corner, just where Madison had decided it belonged. Ethan said people would understand by dessert. I kept moving. In the kitchen, the binder from the earlier nights sat on the sideboard, its spine straight, its weight familiar. Beside it lay the envelope David had given me with copies of the membership transfer and the schedule of members. Next to both sat the folder Sophie had organized. I checked my phone. Confirmations from Lakeview, Russo, Blue Lantern, the credit union. 2 vendors had noted my delivery changes. One had marked the order as donation per payer instruction. The shelter directors had replied to John's introduction and thanked me. In the living room, Ethan adjusted the alignment and told the room that by the end of the night, everyone would feel lighter. He said that was the point of family, to keep each other honest. Emily slipped through a thicket of adult legs and found me. She put her small hand into mine, without a word, and tugged. She leaned in and whispered that the snowflake we had taped still held fast, and that she had made a second one for my window. I told her we would hang it later. She nodded solemnly, then asked if I would sit by her. I told her wherever I sat, I would hear her if she needed me. Linda moved from group to group with a plate of cheese and a practiced nod. She met my eyes once and then let them slide away. I did not chase the look. I had work to do that was not visible, the kind of work that decides whether a structure stands when the wind rises. I went to the mudroom and opened the side door. The yard lay quiet under a new skin of snow, and the streetlight made the flakes glow as they fell. I stood there with the door half closed and made calls that mattered. I confirmed the final delivery windows with the 2 shelters that needed a later drop. I told them I would sign in person and bring the letters they might need if anyone asked questions. I asked where they preferred trays to be staged and whether they had room for pies. The voice at Lakeshore said pies were the best thing for the children who were old enough to forget where they were for 3 minutes at a time. I told her there would be peace. The door creaked. Madison's face appeared in the sliver with a smile that had practiced 1,000 times. She said guests were asking if I would say grace before dinner. She said it might be nice if I kept it short. She did not step into the cold. She smoothed a crease in her dress and went back to the warmth before I answered. I slipped the phone into my pocket and let the weather wash over me. I took the manila envelope from my coat and set it flat against my palm. I thumbed the edges. Then I took the document case from the other pocket and opened it just enough to see Sophie's tabs waiting like mile markers. From where I stood, I could see through the kitchen to the living room. Ethan raised a glass, and a hush moved through the crowd. He told them how much it meant to have everyone together. He told them the year had been a lesson in perspective. He told them after dinner they would share a few memories for a laugh. The room answered with eager sound. He had no idea that laughter could change its target without warning. I closed the door to a narrow gap and leaned my shoulder to the frame. Somewhere down the block, a child squealed at the first snowball of the night. The whole neighborhood kept its own beat, and our house drummed faster than it should. I stepped off the stoop and let the snow take my footprint. I walked across the yard to where the service path ran along the side of the house. It was the path caterers used, the one I had noted a dozen times on invoices when I wanted deliveries to avoid the front hall circus. My shoes sank and rose with the small sound snow makes when it agrees to carry you. I stopped beneath the kitchen window and listened. The clink of glass, the small rise of voices, the scrape of a chair. Emily's laugh bright and quick. I rested the envelope against my chest and felt the firmness of the paper and the steadiness of my heart behind it. My lips moved, and I let a breath carry words into the cold. They wanted a stage. I would show them one. I stood there a moment longer, the snow dusting my shoulders, the light from the window edging my coat. I checked the watch David had given me on a job finished ahead of schedule a lifetime ago. The hour was right. The room inside had set the scene. The players had taken their marks. The guests had found their places and poured their wine. I turned toward the service door and set my hand on the handle. The metal felt clean and cold. The envelope fit under my arm. The case hung from my fingers. The path I had laid over days and years led exactly here. I drew one steady breath, let it out slow, and eased the door inward. The service door gave beneath my hand, and I stepped into the heat of the kitchen, the quiet thrum of the refrigerator, the breath of the oven, the soft rattle of glass from the next room. I closed the door with care and stood still for one slow count, the envelope under my arm and the document case in my hand, the kind of weight a man chooses to carry. I moved along the service hall where caterers usually came and went past the sideboard, where the binder had stood during the day, and stopped in the threshold. Ethan saw me first and let his smile widen, as if relief had arrived dressed as triumph. He said, "Look who finally showed up, the failure himself." A few guests laughed. I crossed the edge of the dining room and set the envelope on the table at the place where a centerpiece should have been. Then I opened it and slid the first stack of invoices into the light. Lakeview Catering, Russo Trattoria, Blue Lantern Bakery. Dates in a neat column that ran across a decade. My name printed at the top of every page. I said these are the catering invoices for the last 10 years, and they were all paid by me. Madison stood nearest the tree and held her glass too tight. She said she was sure there had been gifts and contributions from many people over the years. I lifted another page and set it atop the pile so that the dates were visible to anyone who cared to read. I said the pattern has a way of speaking for itself. Ethan laughed again, too loud this time. He said this was a holiday, not an audit, and that no one wanted to drown in paperwork. He said we all pitched in different ways and that I should relax and enjoy being with family. A chair scraped. David Carter rose from the far end of the table. He said he could vouch for much of what sat on the table and more besides. He said he had signed for deliveries at this very service door and hauled trays in when my back kept me from lifting. He said he had watched drivers ask for Daniel by name because that was who signed their clipboard and handed them envelopes at Christmas. Someone near the window murmured that the dates lined up with every big dinner they could remember. An aunt, who had come early to help, reached for one invoice and then thought better of it. Linda stood by the sideboard. Ethan said none of this changed the tone of the evening. He said we were here to celebrate and to have a little fun, and that I was making things heavy. He gestured to the blank wall and told Madison to cue the first slide. I kept my hand on the stack and said, I have carried this table for a long time. David cleared his throat and asked if I would like him to read the list aloud. I shook my head and told him the papers were enough. A cousin near the tree shifted her feet and asked Ethan if he had known about any of this. Ethan said of course he had known that families do not keep score. Madison said the point of the evening was to laugh and to show how far we had all come. Emily slipped from her place near the tree and came to stand beside me. Her face tilted up enough for only me to see that she was looking for permission. I gave it with a small squeeze. She let out a breath and stayed. The projector hummed. Ethan lifted the remote and then let it rest at his side when no one moved to dim the rest of the lights. The house had gone so quiet that the radiator ticked in the front room, and the clock on the mantel sounded like a metronome teaching patience. A guest reached for a glass and then set it down untouched. People began to read. I took the top page and slid it toward the center so that the words could be read without me in the way. I said every holiday spread you remember is signed for and paid for by me. I said I do not say that to ask for thanks. I say it so that we are honest about who has borne what in this house. Ethan started to speak and stopped when David said, "Let him finish." The two men looked at each other, and something old and simple moved between them. That moment found the room in a quiet way. It did not cheer. It chose. Linda finally set the lighter on the sideboard and walked closer. She looked down at the paper and read. I watched her eyes track the years until they came to the year of the accident and paused there. Madison watched Linda and recalculated. I kept my hand on the stack and let silence do the work. I could feel the heat of many eyes moving off my son and onto the pages. I could feel the room shift its weight from one foot to the other, testing the new ground. Ethan lifted the remote again, almost out of habit. He said, "Let us get back on track." He said the night was about joy. He said we would all laugh in a minute. His voice bumped against a wall it could not see. No one laughed. The projector kept humming at the blank wall. David stepped closer to the table and placed one finger on the page from 2018. He said, I remember the delivery that year because the roads were ice and the driver almost slid past the curb. He said Daniel stood in this doorway, signed his name with a hand that shook from pain and still tipped the man for showing up. A small sound went through the group, not pity, not applause, something like recognition. I drew a breath and felt the room with it. I lifted my hand from the paper long enough to rest it on Emily's hair. She leaned into it. I said we will keep things honest tonight. It was not a challenge. It was a map. A few heads nodded without meaning to. A man near the doorway cleared his throat and said he did not realize. A woman beside him hushed him and said no one had. The center of the room no longer belonged to Ethan. It did not yet belong to me. It belonged to the truth that had been placed in it and to the eyes that had chosen to look. I gathered the top sheets into a neat pile and set them square again. The envelope waited beside them like a finished course of brick ready to carry the next lift. I looked at the projector and then at the blank wall. I could feel the moment gather itself for whatever came after this. The room had turned and settled heavy and still, every gaze that mattered no longer on my son, but on me and on the paper between us. The door opened and Winter came in with 3 men carrying boxes stacked to their chins. The first man stepped forward into the living room light and said he had a delivery for Daniel Whitmore. He set the first stack on the broad end of the dining table right where the candles were waiting to be lit. The second man followed, then the third. Ethan told them they had the wrong address. He said nothing had been ordered in that name. The first man said everything was prepaid under my account, and that the delivery confirmation required my signature only. He added that the rest of the order was already on the road to Lakeshore and North Coast, per written instructions received that afternoon. Madison asked something about mistakes and double orders, and wondered aloud whether the warehouse had mixed up numbers. The second man said the reference matched my account exactly, and that his dispatcher had confirmed twice when the weather turned and routes had to be adjusted. I stepped closer. I told the first man I would soon. He slid the form to me and I wrote my name. He nodded and tucked the page into his clipboard. Ethan reached for one of the boxes and demanded to know what was inside. The third man said the contents were listed in the manifest and packed per health code, ready for service after transport. He set it on the table by my envelope and stepped back. There was turkey packed hot, and safe pans of vegetables, trays of rolls. He told the room that none of this made sense, that the dinner was meant for family, that I had overstepped. He looked around for agreement. I said that the food we expected had been given where it was needed, and that more was on its way as we stood here. I said that tonight the people who needed it most would eat like royalty, and that all you would be left with was emptiness. A few guests clapped. Others murmured. Linda asked quietly, what would we serve now? I told her there was coffee and bread if anyone needed it, and that no one would go hungry in this room. The delivery men turned toward the hall. The first man told me the last truck would leave for North Coast in 10 minutes, and that I could meet them at the loading bay if I wanted to see the handoff. I thanked him. When I turned back, Ethan stood planted at the head of the table, the projector throwing a thin blue scrim across his chest. He said I had ruined everything. He said there were guests. There were expectations. There were people who had driven across town for a holiday. A cousin near the sideboard said that maybe the night had just changed shape. A neighbor said she had friends working at Lakeshore and that the place would be packed. Madison moved toward the boxes as if to reclaim them. I lifted the manifest and read the line that said, "Donation under payer instruction, destination Lakeshore Community Shelter and North Coast Outreach." I placed it beside the invoices. Madison said the children had been looking forward to dessert. I told her some children needed dessert more than ours did, and that in the morning Emily could help me bake something simple. Emily edged back to my side and slipped her hand into mine. She asked if the pies had gone too. I told her they had and asked her if she thought the children would like the kind with the crumble top. She nodded and said they would like the way the sugar cracked under a spoon. A few of the people closest to us heard her, and the tension loosened by another notch. In the far corner, the projector was still waiting. Ethan lifted the remote. He said we could still do the slideshow, and everyone could have a laugh. No one moved. A guest near the tree said maybe the evening had already found its story. Madison asked where the seating would matter if there was nothing to serve. People began to set their glasses down and pick them up again. Linda returned with a stack of simple plates and a basket of bread. She set them near the end and said softly that anyone who was hungry could start with this. Ethan looked at me as if I had moved a wall he had leaned on all his life. He started to say that this was an ambush, and then stopped when he saw David step closer again. David did not speak. He simply stood in the spot where a man stands when he is ready to say something, if needed, and does not need to say it otherwise. It was enough. A few guests clapped again, this time for the men who had carried boxes into a room that had been waiting for a different kind of delivery. Someone near the hallway said they would take a plate of bread to a neighbor who could not make it out in the snow. Another asked if anyone wanted to sing, then laughed at herself and said maybe later. I slid the invoices back into the envelope and set the manifest on top. The paper lay there, honest and still. I let my eyes travel over the faces in the room. Some looked away when I met them. Some held my gaze and nodded. Emily leaned against my leg, warm and solid. Ethan set the remote down and it clicked against the tablecloth. He rubbed his forehead and stared at the blank wall. The room did not follow him back to the center. It stayed where it had learned to stay in the last few minutes, closer to the paper and the quiet. I told the room that anyone who wanted to help me take a few items to the shelters could meet me at the truck in 10. A couple of people nodded. Most did not move. That was fine. The night did not need an audience to do what was right. I reached down and squeezed Emily's hand. She squeezed back and said she knew where we kept the extra gloves. I said that would help. I gathered the manifest and slid it into my coat. The cold waited at the door beyond the foyer, and somewhere across town, a line of people waited under a different set of lights. I moved back into the living room and let the new quiet settle. I set my palm on the envelope of invoices, then reached into my coat for the document case Sophie had packed and placed it beside the stack. I said there were a few more things to make clear before anyone tried to find a laugh again. My voice was steady. I opened the case and drew out the first set of letters, each clipped and labeled. I laid them in a small fan on the table where everyone could see the headings. Removal of authorized users. Account numbers partially redacted. Confirmation emails received. I told the room that any card Ethan or Madison had used with my name at the top was now deactivated and replaced, that the processors had been notified, and that reinstatement would require me in person with identification. I looked at Ethan and said that the attempt to swipe for a ride home or a late-night drink would fail. Madison lifted her phone so fast she almost dropped it. Her thumb moved across the screen. She told Ethan to check his wallet app. He pulled his phone out and then stopped when the screen refused to open without a code he did not have. He tried a second card and then a third. His mouth opened and nothing came out. I took out the next letter and set it down. It was from the credit union, where the so-called wedding fund had lived. I told the room that the account many of them had heard about, as if it were a gift already given. Was mine opened by me, titled to me, and now converted to a certificate with a penalty that would meet anyone who tried to take what was not theirs. I said the withdrawal freeze had been confirmed, and that the only signature that mattered on that account belonged to me. Ethan told Madison to check her notifications. She scrolled, blinked, scrolled again, and then held the phone away. She said she had an email thanking Daniel for the conversion and another noting that digital access had been updated. I slid the third letter forward. It listed delivery changes for the holiday orders and the names and numbers of the shelter directors who would sign for receipt. I told the room that the paper matched what they had already seen with their own eyes, that dinner had gone where it belonged. Ethan said something about families taking care of their own first. A neighbor answered gently that a town is also a family, and that hungry children are ours, whether or not they share our name. By the fireplace, a woman I did not know well asked if any of this could be undone tomorrow. I said it could not. Before I spoke, the door from the hallway opened and Sophie stepped in. She had a small leather folio under her arm. I had asked her to stop by after she finished at the office. She stood near the sideboard. I said, "Some of you may wonder whether this is all proper." Sophie introduced herself by name and by work, and said she represented me for these matters. She spoke plainly. The letters were lawful. The removals had been confirmed by the banks. The trust instruments gave me the authority I had used, and the amendments had been witnessed and notarized. She said the vendors had acknowledged my right as payer to redirect delivery, and that the shelters had confirmed acceptance. She said the documents were available for any person of reason to read, and that she would answer process questions after the evening. She set a smaller folder on the edge of the table and stepped back. Linda reached for the folder as if it were the rail of a staircase she did not trust. She stopped her hand halfway and let it fall. I lifted the thick page and laid it flat. The heading read, Assignment of Membership Interest. Below it the words named the company that had paid for my best years and marked the percentage that had been mine for far longer than anyone in this room knew. I told them that I was a 40% owner of Whitmore Construction. Someone near the window said they had thought the company was Ethan's future to claim. I said futures are built, not handed, and that I had tried to hand him a chance and watched him use it to dig a hole. David said he had been there when the ink dried, and that the numbers on the paper were true. Ethan said this was a performance. He said I had been hiding, and that decent men did not hide. David answered before I could. He said decent men do the work, and let the work speak when it has to. Madison asked if any of this meant her accounts were restored. Sophie told her no. Madison asked if there was anything they could do. Sophie told her they could breathe and adjust, and perhaps think about what it costs when you treat the hand that feeds you like a pocket you are entitled to. I pointed to the line on the document that listed the schedule of members. Names, dates, percentages. Guests who had come for lightness were learning the weight of facts. Linda stepped closer and read the page. She looked at the date and said that she remembered a day at an office that smelled like baking, and a woman with a pen that moved fast. She said she had not understood then what the pages would mean. Ethan told the room that this was unfair. He said I had waited for a moment to make him look small. He said none of it changed the fact that I had failed him. I did not tell him he was wrong. I did not need to. The documents did that work. I told the room that some debts are made of dollars and some of care, and that I had paid both as far as my body and my accounts could stretch. I said the rest of the evening would be honest or it would be nothing at all. A guest near the mantel murmured that the slideshow could wait for another life. Emily's hand found mine again, and she leaned against my side with the trust of a child who had chosen her answer. Ethan stared at the document one last time, then at me, then at the faces that had stopped reflecting his story back to him. Madison stood very still beside him. Linda tried to speak and could not. She did not step toward Ethan. She did not step toward me. She stood between. I gathered the pages in order not to hide them but to keep them square. The projector hummed a little louder. The tree lights kept their soft rhythm. I let the hush hold a moment longer and felt something ease at the base of my neck. I looked at my son, then at the table, then at the doorway that led to the night. I said my son had called me a failure, but the foundation of this house had been me all along, and tonight that foundation was walking out. I slid the documents under my arm and turned toward the hall. Linda did not move to stop me. Ethan held the remote as if it might yet summon a world that would obey him. I passed the coat tree and pulled my sleeves into my jacket. My cane found its place. I pulled and winter rushed in clean and bracing, sweeping the room behind me with a single clear breath. I stepped out and let the door fall softly into its frame. The walk had gathered a fresh skin of white since I had last stood here. I paused at the top of the steps and looked back through the window. I did not lift a hand. Footsteps pattered behind me, and a small shape burst through the door before it could swing shut. Emily ran down the steps with her coat half buttoned and boots untied. She flung her arms around my waist and pressed her face into my jacket. She said she was proud of me. I bent and held her, careful of my back, careful of nothing else. Heat rose behind my eyes and then cooled in the wind. She leaned away to study me and declared that heroes did not have to wear capes if they had a folder. I laughed once, short and real, and told her I would accept that definition. She slipped her mittened hand into mine and asked where we were going. I told her somewhere warm and honest. We started down the walk together. I kept the folder snug under my arm and felt the weight of the years arranged inside it, not heavy, just true. At the gate, I looked back one last time. Through the glass, I could see Linda with one hand against the sideboard, Ethan with his shoulders rounded as if he had finally felt gravity. Madison frozen in a perfect pose that flattered no one. We turned toward the street, and the bells from St. Andrew's began to ring. 12 strokes. Midnight had come without asking permission from anyone. The church windows glowed at the end of the block. Emily swung our joined hands once and then tucked closer when a little wind found its voice. We passed the pharmacy with its neon sign turned low for the holiday, the diner with a lone cook wiping a counter. No one would sit at for hours, the hardware store dark but steady as a closed fist. Emily asked if the children at the shelter would be eating right now. I told her yes. I told her pies taste sweeter when you share them with people who did not think they would taste pie tonight. I told her I did too. She squeezed my fingers and said we could make more tomorrow. The promise walked beside us like a second heartbeat. At the corner, we paused. The street had emptied of cars. Snow sifted from a sky that had run out of colors and settled on a single shade of clean. In that stillness, I finally felt the old weight lift. Not because a room had finally listened, not because paper had said what my tired mouth no longer cared to say, but because I had placed my life back in my own hands and found it fit. My back ached in its old way, and I did not mind. Pain was not the same thing as burden. Burden is when you carry what does not belong to you. We turned toward home for a jacket for Emily and thicker gloves. The porch lights along the block nodded to us as we passed. Through one window, I saw a family gathered around a board game. Through another, a couple dancing without music. Through another, a man reading with his head tilted at a particular angle that said he had fallen into the book and would not be back for a while. Ordinary grace everywhere for those who go looking. At our house, I opened the door long enough to fetch Emily's hat and a scarf that had been knit by hands that no longer shook mine. I took the binder from the sideboard and slid it under the documents from David and Sophie so that the three made a single spine. Emily tugged at my sleeve and asked if we could leave the porch light on for the people going to the shelters, as if the glow might guide them too. I told her that light carries farther than we think, and flipped the switch. We stepped out again and pulled the door shut. I did not lock it out of habit. I locked it because I could. The walk had filled with another thin layer, and we rewrote our own footprints. The church windows waited down the block. I tucked the folder tight and looked at the girl beside me. She nodded as if to say she was ready for whatever came next. At the corner, she tugged and pointed toward the glow. We crossed Maple with care. The plow had passed once and left a low ridge that we stepped over together. In the distance, a siren wailed and then faded, a reminder that the world goes on with or without our small dramas. I felt none of the bitterness that had lived in me for so long. I felt only a kind of quiet that carried its own strength. We reached the church steps and stood in the spill of light. I placed my hand on the rail that I had helped install years ago at a volunteer day and felt the iron solid under my palm. Emily tilted her head back and watched the flakes fall through the glow until the motion made her dizzy, and she laughed at herself. I laughed with her. It felt like air after a closed room. I thought of the house we had left, of the paper we had placed in the center, of the faces that had turned, of the pride that had faltered. I did not hate any of them. I simply knew that my job there was done. The foundation had walked out. The structure behind us would stand or fall on the truth it had finally met. That was no longer my problem to solve. We started back toward the truck, and as we walked, I felt the folder under my arm like a living thing. Not a weapon anymore. A deed. A map. A record of a man who had done the work and learned at last to let it speak. Emily swung our hands again and told me the first thing we should bake in the morning. I told her the kitchen was hers to command. Some families keep you chained. Justice is sometimes the decision to let go and step forward. If you have been dismissed or belittled or called a failure, remember this. The foundation is under your feet, not theirs. Hit like if you've ever had to rise above being dismissed. Share this to empower those still trapped by family chains. And subscribe, because the journey to breaking free starts with one small decision today.